Hello and welcome to this webinar. Thanks for joining us for another series of the In Conversation BAPT webinars. My name is Richard Owen. I am the current treasurer for the BAPT, the British Association for Psychological Type. We are a volunteer-run charity, and our purpose is to encourage best practice and knowledge and learning to do with psychological type, that's MBTI and other systems of typology. We've got a great conversation tonight with a special guest, Steve Myers, and Steve has recently published this book, which you can buy. It's published by Routledge. It's called Myers-Briggs Typology versus Jungian Individuation. It's got some fantastic ideas, which he's going to explain to us a bit about how Jung's model of typology and the Myers-Briggs model differ and how we can understand it better. Steve himself is joining us from Yorkshire in the UK tonight, and a bit of background, he's on his third career currently. In the 80s he was an IT manager, in the 90s and 2000s he was a consultant using MBTI and other instruments for management and team development. In the late 90s he developed a team role questionnaire that's compatible with the MBTI. For various reasons, this led him on to research the differences between Myers-Briggs and Jungian theory, and took a more formal turn in 2007, studying a master's degree in Jungian and post-Jungian studies, which was here in the UK, and followed by a PhD in psychoanalytic studies on a Jungian topic. So the book's a spin-off from his PhD work, and I'm going to introduce Steve now. Hi, Steve.
Hi. I have to apologise first of all that I don't have my broadband has gone down, so I'm speaking on the phone rather than via live video. I think it's a Victorian broadband. I think Prince Albert installed it, and it's not coping very well with the traffic tonight, I don't think. So that's why I'm speaking on the phone, unfortunately.
Oh, never mind. Well, let's get straight into it then. I'm interested in the sort of the thesis of your book. What's it all about? What's the idea? And can you give us a quick explanation?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to take part in this series of conversations, and thanks for sort of letting me sort of do a brief introduction. I realise your webinars are normally very informal. But you've kindly allowed me to use a couple of slides just to explain where I'm coming from in terms of looking at the future of typology. And I sort of want to pick up on a point made by Roger Pearman in your last webinar, because he said, and I don't know how many people sort of noticed it, but he said that Myers-Briggs and Jungian theory are different, and that was quite an important point. And that's basically what the book does. It explores how they're different, and that they're different paradigms, and looks particularly at the things that have been overlooked about the Jungian paradigm from his book Psychological Types. And what I'd like to do is explain one of the key differences, if I may, between those paradigms. Could you put up slide 2 for me, Richard, please?
Yeah.
Let me know when.
Bring this up now. I need to actually set it off. Here we go. Can you see the slides?
I can't see the slides at the moment. I've got no. I keep clicking to try and reconnect, but the connection goes down. But if I manage to get a connection back, then I'll be able to get back onto live video. But at the moment, it seems to be not connecting at all. So you've got slide 2 up.
Okay. So I'm going to make sure, see if people can see it from the chat. Yes, slides are there. So Sarah, thank you for that. So
okay,
slide 2 here.
Yeah. So when Jung developed his theory around the time of the First World War, it had 4 main stages. This is different. If there are any psychotherapists who are participating, this is different to his model for psychotherapy, which also had 4 stages. But the model for psychotherapy is a different 4 stages. This process of development is usually viewed as a sort of pattern for the whole of life, but it can also describe the development of our attitude towards particular pairs of opposites, such as Democrat versus Republican, or in the UK, Remain versus Leave the EU. And in psychological types, Jung illustrates the process of overcoming opposites with the example of the typological functions, but he intends it to be applied to other opposites as well. And that's one of the things that is often missed out. So just to briefly run through these four stages. So the first stage is unconsciousness. That means we're unaware of the differences between the opposites. And in the second stage, we differentiate one of the opposites. We develop a better understanding and awareness of that side, and it becomes a superior form of knowledge. And the other side, the opposite, remains unconscious, and our knowledge of it is inferior. And because it's unconscious, we tend to project it into other people or organizations, seeing them as having inferior qualities. And just as sort of an aside here, one of the things I'm working on doing some research at the moment is actually to the extent to which people do see others or experience other people as inferior as a result of their the attitude they take. And I'm looking particularly at politics at the moment. Then in stage 2, we differentiate another function, which people working in Myers-Briggs typology would know as the auxiliary. And then we differentiate a third function, which means that, there could be, two auxiliaries in effect, if there is still a dominant function. And we then go on to the third stage, which is when we try to differentiate the fourth function. And that's when something really different starts to happen. Because as the quote on the left-hand side from Marie-Louise von Franz shows, that something happens, the structure of the personality collapses, and something different happens that is neither none of the functions. So in this third stage, we try to differentiate the fourth function, and we hold the tension of opposites, and it leads to some kind of change that's taking place. And in the final stage, the transcendent function forms in the unconscious, and this is a fifth function. And at first, it produces a symbol, and as we let the meaning of that symbol unfold, it transforms our attitude in a way that reconciles the opposites and bridges the divide between consciousness and the unconscious. Now, if you can go on to slide 3. Is that up now? Yep.
There we are.
Okay. So let's have a look at what the development looks like in the Myers-Briggs paradigm, because the first stage is the same. And in the second stage, from a Myers-Briggs typology point of view, you develop two functions, so a dominant and auxiliary. And typology sort of edges into the third stage by developing the third and fourth functions to some degree. However, there's an important difference here, that the inferior function is not given parity with the superior function. So there's no tension of opposites. There's no transcendent function that merges. There's no fifth function, and there's no reconciliation of the opposites. And Isabel Briggs Myers did recognize that transcendence was possible, but she recommended against it. And there's a couple of quotes on the left-hand side where she says that. So if you can go on to slide 4.
There we go.
That model of development for personal development is looking at the state of different functions within an individual, and somebody remains a type, and they remain the same type throughout their life in that development model. So it doesn't actually reconcile the functions, the superior and the inferior functions within the individual. However, Myers-Briggs typology does itself reconcile different types within relationships. So you could say that Myers-Briggs typology is itself a form of transcendent function within a group setting. It develops a new shared attitude in a group and begins to connect the group with its unconscious and the unconscious dynamics that have been taking place within a group. So that's sort of a key difference between sort of Myers-Briggs typology and Jungian typology, is that, or the first key difference is that from the individual point of view, it doesn't go to stage 4, which is where there is a sort of a regression before we start progressing. Another key difference is that I said earlier that Jung used typological functions as an example. They are a very important and a frequently occurring example. However, his theory applies to a much wider range of opposites than just typological functions or different personality types. And if perhaps you could go on to slide 5, this is the last slide. I'm almost at the end of my sort of introductory bit, just explaining where I see the sort of the future of typology going. Is that up?
Yes.
I'll keep talking away. So what Jung does actually in psychological types is not just talk about typology. He offers us potential solutions to a very wide range of opposites. Politics, religion, culture clashes. And one of the examples for us in the UK is the problem of remaining or leaving in the European Union. And that is an area where Jung's theory of opposites can be applied. Now, by saying that, I do not mean that we look at Brexit, i.e. UK leaving the EU, through the lens of typological functions. This is not about asking which types voted to leave and which voted to remain, nor looking at the preferences or personality types of the leaders. It's standing back now completely from that and saying, look, there are two fundamentally different and opposing attitudes here. One is saying the UK should remain in the in the EU rather, sorry, and the other attitude says the UK should leave the EU. And these are two, political attitudes that are clashing in the UK at the moment and causing great turmoil in our political system. And what Jung's theory of opposite does is suggest a way of reconciling those two attitudes. But firstly, we've got to do it in ourselves, and then we've got to be able to do it in our relationships and our groups. And what we have at the moment is actually a great deal of one-sidedness. So we've got to get to the stage where as individuals we can carry the opposites. And it's only by carrying the opposites that we can actually start to see the way of reconciling it emerging. And as Edward Edinger succinctly said, we carry the opposites when we got to that stage. The most important opposite of all is between consciousness and the unconscious. That underpins the conflict between all other opposites. And so an opposite is really of significance when one is conscious and the other is unconscious. And that's the problem we have in the UK at the moment between Remain and Leave, is that for the two sides, their own side is very conscious and sophisticated and well developed and so on. And the other side of the argument, the other attitude, is unconscious and therefore it's not well developed, and it's wrapped up with all sorts of inferior instincts. And so you get the two sides blaming each other and accusing each other. The Remain side accusing the Leavers of being xenophobic, the Leavers accusing the Remain side of being traitors, and things like this. You get these very primitive accusations being thrown around. So going back to the question of the future of typology, for me the future of typology is that it should be a stepping stone to personal and cultural transformation through our learning, first of all through typology, but then learning how to apply the method to other forms of attitude on how to transcend and reconcile opposite attitudes. So typology is an important and frequently occurring exemplar of Jung's theory of opposites. But rather than it being a self-encompassed theory, it should be a gateway into a much wider range of applications that are aimed at resolving political, religious, and other forms of conflict. So, sorry, that was a whistle-stop tour through the differences between Isabel Briggs Myers and Jung, or one of the differences, and the significance that it has, I think, the potential significance it has for the future of typology.
It's very interesting, yeah. So, I mean, basically this idea of opposites going beyond typological functions is quite a major thing, in that you don't have to just analyze everything in terms of type. Fact that there are two, although you could argue that that's the, with the referendum, that's the questions that people were actually posed with, rather than it emerging as a natural pair of opposites. I guess that was just what they were shown on a ballot paper. But I get the point. There's this definitely strongly polarized people in either direction. I just want to go back to this slide about the functions, because I'm just clarifying, when you talk about functions, I guess you're often talking about what Jung would call the basic functions, as in sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, as whole, rather than the 8 function attitudes. Is that correct?
Well, yes, the basic. I'm here talking about the basic functions, and I'm talking about the four functions. I'm not really drawing any distinction. I know there are distinctions. There are different ways of looking at type. I'm not drawing any distinction between the four functions and the 8 function attitudes. I mean, obviously, you know, in psychological types, Jung does describe the 8 function attitudes because you know, we differentiate if we differentiate a function and become one-sided, then we tend to differentiate it in a particular direction. So if we differentiate a function, then yes, a function will be. If we differentiate intuition, we might differentiate it in an introverted direction. So that does become our type or our one-sidedness, and it can be allied, you know, as we know, with thinking or feeling. But Jung didn't really sort of pay too much attention in unpacking the relationship between the four functions and and extroversion and introversion, because for him the key difference was between the superior function in whichever orientation it was and the inferior function in which, you know, typically in the opposite orientation. And what matters is not what type you are or the way that you've differentiated, but whether or not you give the inferior function parity. So whether you're talking about 8, you know, 4 functions, 8 function attitudes, 8 types, or 16 types, and the 16 types are in psychological types, he started to list them and then didn't complete the list. And the reason he didn't complete the list is because he didn't see it as important. The types themselves are collective. You know, if you declare yourself to be a type, you're declaring yourself to be the same as several 100 million other people in the world. Individuality, the individual, only emerges when you give the true individuality only emerges when you give the superior and inferior function parity, and you hold the opposites in tension, and then the individual comes between them. So, I mean, yes, in this presentation here, I've only concentrated on the 4 functions, and yes, you can talk about the 8 function attitudes or the 16 types, but the argument is still the same. They're collective descriptions. That, you know, we have in each of us, we have you know, collective attitudes and we have individual attitudes, and it's through the parity of opposites, through holding the tension of opposites, that we develop the more individual attitudes to go alongside the collective attitudes that we hold.
That's good. So I'm just interested as well, like, what degree have people in the type community who are, let's say, more forward thinking and integrating multiple models, because not everybody sticks with the sort of basic Myers-Briggs presentation that, let's say, would be in Gifts Differing, the book, and the more introductory sort of material. And a lot of people who come to BAPT conferences and APTI conferences will be kind of, to some degree, starting to go down this path that I think you're already laying out here, that Jung was talking about, sometimes through the work of Jungian analysts who are also some of which are into type. So what have you seen that encourages you to see that people might be starting to already go down this more developmental path?
Well, I think you know, I think the best and most well-known example is probably John Beebe's work. I mean, John Beebe actually, in one sense, he works within the you know, the constraints or the systematization of the Myers-Briggs model. But in his work, I'm not sure everybody you know, I think a lot of people don't necessarily use his model in this way. But the way he uses his model is that you know, he uses the 8 function attitudes and allies them to the archetypes as a developmental model, so that as you differentiate the functions and as you come to terms with the archetypes that are associated with each of the function attitudes, then what actually happens is you start to go through the individuation process. I think you know, so when you look at what John Beebe does with his model, I would say I mean, it's a post-Jungian model, but he uses it in a pretty Jungian way because he's using it in a constructive way. I think one of the problems that Jung had with psychological types, and I think to some degree, I think this also happens with John Beebe's model as well, is that a lot of people come at it in a Freudian way. And by Freudian, what I mean is the difference is that it's used in a reductive way, it's used in a descriptive way. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but what Jung's argument was you can't stop with the reductive approach. You've got to be constructive. So you reduce things down into types, but then once you've reduced things down into types, you then have to start constructing something new and individual. So Jung's theory is all about becoming. It's about what, it's not about what you were born as and, being true to that type. It's about recognizing where you started out, how you've developed, how you use the functions, but then becoming more individual through your development. And I think Beebe's model does do that. But I think, I would say there are two camps in using it. There's the people who come to Beebe's model in a Freudian way, use it as a description of themselves, and there are people who come to Beebe's model in a constructive way, which is to say, right, what I need to do is to get to grips, with these functions and with the archetypes, and particularly with the inferior function. And John Beebe does himself say, that it is, and he in fact, I think, points back to the von Franz work on this, that was von Franz who pointed to the relationship between the superior and the inferior function and how that leads to the emergence of the, of the transcendent function. So I don't know if that's a sort of a complicated answer, but in short, I think some of the people who do this are some of the people who use Beebe's model, but not all.
Yeah, I mean, I found when I read your book, I found, like, being a follower of Beebe's work myself, I found myself saying, yeah, but I'm already thinking in a more holistic developmental way with a wider integration of different opposites and functions. So I felt like I was with you on that, already, and I was like, yeah, this is good. And actually, that's one of the reasons I really wanted to get you on here, because I'm with you on the whole idea of this becoming as a developmental journey. And I just want to try and get people a clearer idea of what these steps might look like. Let's get more concrete, because I know I like to abstract a lot. And what are these 4 steps? I'm now on slide 2 again. The sort of 4 steps of Jungian individuation. So let's give an example of a person like going through this journey and what each stage might actually look like. Picking a pair of opposites that we can use as an example.
Well, let's just take one pair as an example, one pair of functions, sensing and intuition. And let's assume that somebody, and I think this illustration should hopefully translate into different countries and not just work in the UK, but I think you can see, that there are some football managers who have a clear, sensation preference, because they want to bring people into their team who've got experience, they've got a proven track record, they know that there's a known goal scorer and so on. And you've got other football managers who are all concerned about developing potential. And, they are the sort of people who, aren't necessarily looking to spend lots of money on football players to bring them in to bolster the team, but they're interested in the youth system and making sure that people come through and they get plenty of opportunity to play and develop their talent and so on. So, there is two opposites that are, in theory, irreconcilable. But actually, this transcendent function isn't anything, and Jung said this transcendent function isn't anything mysterious. It's nothing, metaphysical or anything. It's just a way of reconciling and combining the opposites. And I think the example of somebody who reconciles and combines these is someone who's got a really good talent system. That so, for instance, if you've got a talent development system or talent management system that measures the potential for somebody, you are there at that point in time combining both sensing and intuition, because you're measuring it. You're saying let's establish some facts. Here we've got a 13-year-old, 14-year-old. Where do they compare against everybody else? Let's draw a graph of where, how people typically develop. Where do they compare in terms of their speed, in terms of their skill, etc., etc.? And therefore, what we want to do is to actually identify the people who are sort of on the, on the higher end of that graph. So when you start looking at a talent, a talent development graph and sort of the pipeline of talent that's coming through, you're actually combining sensing and intuition in the same thing. So, the idea that sensing and intuition are irreconcilable is true at one stage in time, and that's why some football managers say, if we're going to be successful, we've got to bring in people with experience, and other football managers take the other approach, say we need to have people with potential, but you can combine the two. It is possible to combine the two, and in a sense, it's not an intellectual exercise. The real driver of individuation is when one is conscious and one is unconscious. And so, just to give you an example from myself, I don't declare a type anymore, and that's a deliberate choice, because in psychological types, Jung says you've got to desist exercising preference. And so what I did was, many years ago, was I started putting myself in situations that were completely the opposite to my preferences. So I would start to, I did something like, trying to learn to ride a motorbike at the age of 42. And it's not, I know that's sort of a midlife cliche, but I remember on the very first lesson, I stopped at one point, and I thought, what I can't cope with this, because because I don't know if you've ever ridden a motorbike, but when you're driving a car, the gear is on your left hand, but on a motorbike, it's on your left foot. Your brakes are normally on your right foot in the car, whereas in a motorbike, they're on your right hand and right foot, and the clutch is on your left foot in a car, and in a bike it's on. And I suddenly realised that I couldn't cope with that, and not only could I not cope with it, but I couldn't cope with the way that I was being taught, which was in a very, very sort of sensing, thinking way, which was to learn by repetition and building up slowly. And I did the same with drums as well, which was even more so, putting myself in that sort of situation. And it got to the stage where I got through that, but I realised that this was something that I really would have resiled from had I not had that determination to say I've got to put myself in situations that are completely the opposite and see what comes out the other end. I know those are fairly simple example, and another simple example is running workshops. Starting to do things that are completely, I can only do it to a certain amount. It could only cope with a certain amount at that stage, but starting to do things that were completely outside my preferences, such as in presentations, having it really, really highly structured and planned, which was certainly the contrary to my sort of go with the flow approach that I had before. And I think these little things, people in the Myers-Briggs world know, but the difference is, going back to that thing on stage 3, is that there's a ceiling there that's when Isabel Briggs, in fact, if you put, let me just read that out. Let me just put slide 3 up.
Yeah, I've got that.
So the first quote, this is in Conversations with Isabel in 1977. It's on video. Jung does speak of the transcendent function when you can go over the enantiodromia or something, or going over to the opposite. I don't know. I'm sure it's possible to get a great deal more respect for the third and the fourth and to make a great deal more use of them, but I never advise anything more than getting them into the service of the functions you care about most. That's the key difference, is that for Jung it was a question of saying, no, you've got to give them parity. And it's only when you give them parity then that the attitude starts to be, something strange starts to happen in the attitude. The quote below, Isabel Briggs Myers did acknowledge that it is possible, but she recommended that people didn't do it because it is difficult. It can be very, very difficult putting yourself in those types of situations. It can be difficult, when you said going back to political examples. If you're a Democrat, it can be difficult to say, hold on a second, I've got to stop slagging off all these Trump supporters, and I've got to say, hold on a second, there was something they positively voted for. There's a reason they've put them in. What is that positive reason? And similarly, vice versa. You know, people who supported Trump have got to perhaps put down all the conspiracy theories they have about the Democrats and say, well, they brought something as well. There is something on both sides. I'm not saying there's moral equivalence, but there is something on both sides that we need to respect, and we need to respect both. And I think when you take a politically one-sided view, that is an incredibly difficult thing to do, because it seems to be sacrificing what you've been brought up to believe is the difference between right and wrong. And that goes to the nub of it. You actually say, well, hold on a second, what I thought was evil, is actually, there's something valid in it. It needs to be respected. Mm. So I think what I'm saying is not something drastically new in the Myers-Briggs rule. What I'm saying is that actually there's a lid there in the way that Myers-Briggs theory is taught, which says that you always stay within your type. Whereas for Jung, in psychological types, he said, no, you give them parity, you desist from exercising preference, and then something else happens. You start to develop a more individual. It's like holding open the lift or elevator doors, for a lift that's stuck. You prise open the doors and hold them against the tension, and that enables the occupants of the lift or elevator to climb out when it's stuck. And it's the same thing. What you're doing is you're prizing open, two conscious standpoints, and it's the contents of the unconscious and the individuality that's then able to climb out and start to become a new attitude.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So let's go back. I just want to go back to this example of the football managers, because I was starting to follow you on that, and now I just want to tell the story of what that looks like in the 4 steps. Let's say I'm a football manager, and I have a pair of opposites, sensing and intuition. One of them, the sensing, is like potentially leading me towards wanting some sort of concrete, sort of evidential basis for the people that I'm bringing on board on my team. And the other one is looking at future possibilities for their development. Now, when it's in the level of unconsciousness, what might people see, or what might I experience?
Well, the level of unconsciousness, they really wouldn't know the difference between the two, because unconsciousness is not the nature of consciousness is to discriminate. So unconsciousness is not knowing really what the difference. So it'd be like you or me suddenly being put in charge of a Premier League football match. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak for you, but I really wouldn't have a clue what to do and how to run a football club. So I think as far as running a football club is concerned, then we're at the stage of unconsciousness. I'll give you. I'm sorry, it's going to be a UK example, because I can't think of an example from from other countries or an international example. But if we look at somebody like Jose Mourinho, who's managed lots of football clubs, around Europe and been extremely successful, then he's always taken the approach that what you do is you buy in experience. You get people who have proven themselves and can perform on the pitch, and that's the way that he works. It can bring success, and in fact, this is one of the things that Jung said in Psychological Types. When you take a one-sided approach in society, it brings success, because a psychological function is a social function. It serves the needs of society, either directly or through compensation or whatever, but it's a social function. In fact, Jose Mourinho at Manchester United has been replaced by Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who's gone completely the other way. His approach is to say, well, he's actually just sold the 2 most experienced strikers, and he's put in an incredibly young team, and they're starting to give. I think one of the players is about 17 years old or something, because he can see the potential. He said, we're building for the future. Now, this is all fairly standard, standard type of stuff as far as type is concerned, looking at the difference between sense and intuition. So I would say that they're both at stage 2 in that case, because what they've done is they've become one-sided in their approach and are taking a particular type of approach. although Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has also brought in a bit of experience as well, because he's bought a defender for £80 million. So he's showing a bit of sort of interest in, you know, the opposite side as well. It's much more difficult then to start describing somebody at level 3 or 4. But for that, I would say probably we could look at somebody like Pep Guardiola, who similarly has managed around Europe, but he has his own way of doing things. He doesn't just either develop youth or buy an experience. He's got a particular way of doing things, and it's something that nobody's has really thought of before. His playing system, the way he develops his staff, it's much more all-encompassing. And so for me, when I look at those three people, those three managers, in terms of what they're doing with the football club, then they fall into those, you know, different stages. Jose Mourinho and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Well, Jose Mourinho's at stage 2. He's an experienced man. He says, I need to buy experience. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is primarily a developing potential man, just erring into a little bit of stage 3 with saying, okay, but I'll use a bit of experience as well. But Pep Guardiola is somebody who uses it all. He seems to integrate it all and put it all together. And you know, it's not a matter of saying I prefer one approach or the other. He says I'll use my own individual approach, and you know, experience and youth will help support my individual approach to managing a football club. It won't dominate it.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is like you brought in the idea of the symbol here. I know when Jung writes about symbols, you know, he had a very, well, literally active imagination, and that's what he practiced. And that, you know, he could sort of, in his mind's eye, see symbolic representations of these things, and obviously in dreams as well. I mean, how might that come across, like, let's say in a dream, or so for a football manager who's reaching this stage 4?
Well, it's very difficult to give an example in that case, because I haven't been a football manager and I haven't actually seen you know, them actually demonstrating sort of awareness of symbols as such. But a symbol can be almost anything, and what might actually happen is that let me go back to the Jose Mourinho example, and I'm talking hypothetically here. But what could be a symbol? What could have been a symbol? It hasn't happened this way. What could have been a symbol is when he took over at Manchester United and he said, "I need experience." Something that happens, and you know, the classic way symbols appear is through dreams and so on. But symbols can also appear in the outer world as well. And something may have happened with one of his youth players when suddenly he was aware that within that youth player there was an awful lot of experience, and so he might have, you know, looked at one of the younger players and thought, you know, you're only 18, but you've got the head of a 30-year-old on you. You look as if you're an experienced player, and that's really puzzling. You know, why is it that a 17-year-old demonstrates the experience of a 30-year-old player? And he would need to pay attention to that and to learn from that. Whereas if you don't pay attention to symbols, and this is an important theme in psychological types, if you don't, then you say, oh no, he's a 17-year-old. He doesn't have the experience. End of story. I need somebody with experience. So the difference is being aware of the things that suddenly hit you as being, you know, that's really important, and that's challenging the way that I think. You know, sometimes even it might be, and in fact, it's even more importantly sometimes when it's something that you really don't like. You say, you know, I don't like the fact they might play another team. I don't like the fact that there was an 18-year-old in the opponent's team and he just tore our team to shreds. You know, he just made us look like novices. You know, I really don't like that. And when you don't like something and you get upset about it, that's sometimes, you know, when some really important symbolic work needs to be done. So the symbols can come from anything, and it's sort of when it hits you and challenges you and says, hold on a second, that's got to really challenge the way that I think and make me think in a completely different way. That's the point about symbols. In the book, one of the symbols that I refer to is in the Northern Ireland peace process. There was when they finally managed to not only sign the Good Friday Agreement, but actually get power sharing up and running properly in 2007. You had Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness sitting down and working together. Now, Ian Paisley had been calling for 30, 40 years for Martin McGuinness to be sent to prison, and he was said he would never ever work with him because he was evil. And there's still very deep problems in Northern Ireland, but somebody took a photograph of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness together after they had started power sharing, laughing and joking. And it was a symbol that actually challenged entrenched attitudes. And it made people think, hold on a second, what's going on here? Because, this is our hero having a laugh and a joke with our enemy. What on earth, and both sides said that. So what on earth is going on here? And that's what a symbol does. It challenges the way that we think. And we have to look out for them and let the meaning of them unfold. And in chapter 5 of Psychological Types, Jung describes, in Carl Spitler's story, Prometheus and Epimetheus, Jung describes two opportunities for the opposites to be reconciled. The first is a symbol comes along and they reject it. And they say, no, we don't need that symbol, thank you very much. We're doing perfectly fine. We're successful. We'll carry on. And then, because they don't pay attention to the symbol, then the second symbol comes along through a disaster. Disaster strikes. Things really, really go badly as a result of them neglecting to look for symbols and neglecting to recognize it when it comes along.
Wow, so yeah, these examples of things that exemplify the cooperation between these opposites. And I've heard it explained as, the symbol's there because it can't be better explained in any other way other than this analogy or metaphorical symbolic way. Is that correct? In that is, it's better than words, and trying to explain it, there's something there which exemplifies what we're talking about.
Yes, although one thing I would say is that the symbol is in Psychological Types, at the end of chapter 5, when Jung talks about the symbol, what he says is it's a symbol of a new attitude. So it's not something static. Symbols can bridge the opposites, and they can bridge consciousness and the unconscious. But once you get the symbol, in his model, it's not a question of saying, right, you have a symbol, that's it, end of story. They're all bridged. Actually, what the symbol should do is the meaning of the symbol should unfold, and it ushers in a new psychological function and a new attitude. So we then go on. And that attitude itself is still, that new attitude is still one-sided in other ways. Or the opposites may only have been partly reconciled. So the symbol, yes, you're right, initially it's ineffable. We can't make sense of it. It's numinous, or it's mysterious, or it's puzzling, or it's challenging, we don't know why. We just recognize it as something important, and we can't put words into it. But the meaning then unfolds. It's like a dream. When you get a dream and you write it down, in your dream diary, and you think, I have no idea what this dream means. And then over the next, few hours, days, weeks, and so on, through whatever technique you use, the meaning of the dream starts to unfold, and you suddenly realize, hold on a second, there's something here. There's an important message here. There's something important going on in my unconscious psyche that I need to pay attention to, and it then changes your attitude. So this model of Jung's is not a static one where we achieve a symbol, end of story. The symbol is actually symbolizes a new function and a new attitude, and we should go on and develop and cultivate that new attitude, and then go on, to look for more. The Jung consciousness is endless in terms of the amount of stuff that can come out of it. So we can keep going ad infinitum. So it's a dynamic thing. It's a changing thing. The symbol isn't static. It changes and comes and it goes, unfolds into a new attitude. New symbols come, etc.
It's fascinating. I'm conscious of time and that the advertised sort of length of the webinar we've reached, but I would like to continue this because we've got, say, 14 people listening in right now. What I would like to do is perhaps, if I know myself and Steve are able to do this, if anyone else wants to stay on, then we could have some questions and some more discussion, and also keep that as part of the recording, which would eventually make it to YouTube, hopefully. So because this is such an interesting and wide topic, I do want to make this a little bit more than a previous in conversation. I know that's coming a little bit last minute for people's planning, but if anybody does want to stay on right now, we can continue, and if anyone does have to leave, then I said we can endeavour to make the video available later, and that would hopefully keep everybody happy and also allow us to continue. Steve, do you think that would be good for you to maybe answer some questions?
Yep. No, I'm happy to continue.
In that case, what I would like to do is say to everyone who's listening, at the bottom of your Zoom screens, there should be a Q&A button. And if anybody wants to ask a question on what we've heard so far, or any of the things that they've read, if anyone's read Steve's book or anything else on his work, then this is an opportunity to have some questions posed and to sort of discuss things further. So I want to throw that out there. If anyone wants to find the Q&A button, it's down at the bottom. You kind of hover your mouse over probably over a bar there that will have it. So don't all jump at once. But do post some questions. I'll let you all think about it. We've got one here. We've got one in the chat actually. So this is from. Should I read this to you, Steve?
Yeah, my broadband's still down, so I can't. I've just had a look on the router. It's still not connected, so you'll have to read it out to me. I can't see it on the screen. Okay, so this was from Jeff Hart, and he's saying excellent, Steve. He's saying it's a quote here. He's giving us a quote actually. He says, from Jung's psychological types, the quote is, individuation is a process of differentiation. Its goal, the development of the individual personality. That's from page 448, which version you're reading of. Is there a question in this, Jeff, as well? I'm wondering whether you want to expand on that at all. Well, the one thing about I'd say about differentiation is I think that I get frustrated with Jung sometimes because his writing style is appalling at times, and I think Psychological Types is probably the second worst book ever that I've read, and the first worst book ever is Collective Works 5, Symbols of Transformation. It doesn't make things clear. What I think is one of the things that he doesn't make clear in differentiation is that he actually talks about two types of differentiation in Psychological Types. One is the differentiation of a function from all the other functions, and that can make us one-sided. The quote that Jeff just gave is a different type of differentiation. It's differentiation of the individual from the collective, and that occurs when we give the inferior function parity with the superior function.
Yeah, different kinds of differentiation, I guess. That's and Jung used the same word in different contexts. Is that correct?
Yeah.
We've got another question here. This is from Elizabeth Murphy. Hello, Elizabeth. I'd like to say I'm a big fan of your work as well. So welcome to, and thanks for posing a question here. She says, I always thought the parity of the functions was in the equality of availability of the functions, not the ease of use or quality of use. I thought the fourth function would always require more energy that could be accessed and used competently. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think she's right. I think parity can mean different things depending on where the individual is at. I think you're right. It's not necessarily it's not ease of use. I think ease of use is a question of skill, and Jung doesn't actually sort of talk about skill or competence very much. What he talks about, and a word that occurs quite a lot, is attitude. And it's our attitude towards the opposite functions. So I'm not even sure I'd go quite as far as Elizabeth said. You can't develop the same quality of function necessarily. it's not a question of me becoming, for instance, in my motorbike riding, me becoming an expert motorbike rider. It's a question of taking the attitude that both are important, and actually both need to be taken. Both sides of the opposites need to be taken into account. So, to give another practical example, or to build on a practical example I've talked about before, when running a workshop, I talked about how I had put a lot of planning in to a particular workshop, with 130 people. So when they turned up, they all had envelopes with their names on, telling them where they should go, etc., etc., etc. It's not a question of saying I should be getting to the stage where that is something that I find as easy to do as my original preferences. It's more a question of attitude to say, and I keep using this word attitude because it runs as a hidden theme right the way through psychological types. It's an attitude towards it to say, look, when I'm running a workshop, it's really important that I take account of all 4 functions, both attitudes, all 8 function attitudes. So my attitude towards them is one of parity, one of equality. It's not that one is better than the other or one is more important than the other. They are all equally important. So, I think Elizabeth raises a very good point about parity. But as I say, the key word I focus on is not ease of use, not even sort of the qualities. You can tell when a function is inferior very often by the inferior qualities that it demonstrates. But really the thing that we need to develop is a different attitude towards the superior and the inferior function, where we don't try and say one is superior and the other is inferior. We actually recognize they're equal. It's the attitude for me is the key word.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's something John Beebe's model also embraces, the qualitative relationship that we have to the different functions, and therefore to other people. And that brings me on to the point of projection, which is something you talk about and is an interesting part in your book. The idea of having that, let's say, sometimes a negative qualitative relationship to a particular opposite or function, and projecting that onto other people, and, like as you said before, seeing them as the bad one, as the evil out there. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about projection, because that was something I found really interesting in your book when you use that as a topic.
Just as an aside about this, and this does develop your point. I think you raise a very good point. I had a debate with the copy editor who was working on the book, and she changed. I hadn't thought a great deal about it, but I'd written every instance of projection. I'd written project into, and she said, "No, you project onto." And one of the things that I said, "No, that conveys the wrong message. Project onto implies that it's something that is not part of the person themselves, but it's something that's on the outside, that you can recognize on the outside. Projecting into is where the person really does become inferior. So if we go back to the battle between Democrat and Republic, or Remain and Leave in the UK, each side, the 2 sets of attitudes, actually do believe that the other really is inferior. This isn't something that they recognize as happening. They say, well, my opinion of you is inferior. They really are inferior. It's a reality thing. And this actually ties in as well with a philosophy point that Jung makes in chapter 1 when he's laying his foundations. He says, we create the reality we experience. He doesn't say it quite those terms, but that's what he means. He says, the psyche creates reality every day. We create the reality that we experience in the shape of our own psyche. So if we have a psyche with a superior side and an inferior side, then we experience one side as superior and the other side as inferior. So it is a process of projection, but it's even more than that. We actually project it right into the person so that they become, it's projective identification. They become the inferior thing.
Wow, yeah, that's a really important point, because you're not aware of it, and that person's entire being, in essence, becomes that quality which you project into them. I like that way of looking at it. So, have we got any other questions? That's my next point here. Elizabeth, has that expanded, or have you got any other thoughts on that question that you asked? Anyone else got any thoughts? If not, I've got a question. I mean, I was thinking about the Myers-Briggs, sort of like the limitation of that model. And a point that you make, Steve, in your book is that people often, I can't really find the quote exactly now, but people do kind of get stuck. Like, it's quite unusual for people to really individuate and to develop. Like, there's this, I don't know what the statistic would be. Perhaps you can expand, out of the population, like what sort of percentage of people would be likely to overcome even at least some of their opposites in this way that you're putting forward as a development path?
Well, there is, I think, I can't wait to, but at the end there is a sort of a bit of a graph on that. So I think it does support. I can't put numbers on it, but it's on page 183 if you've got the book in front of you.
Yeah.
So in the research, and this is from my PhD research, that the degree of one-sidedness seems to spread out as we get older, particularly from the sort of the 30s onwards. And Jung said, midlife comes around 35 to 40. For me, it started when I was about 27, 28, for various reasons, very stressful time. But the scores start to spread out, and I think what he said was, there are lots of different paths that people can take, and I think the evidence from the data that I collected is that he was right. Some people do become more one-sided, some people do individuate, some people do completely flip and become their opposite. So it does happen, and I think it does happen, quite naturally in some people. But I think also in some of us, we stay one-sided, and I think, if you like, the last slide that I showed is really, I'm trying to make the argument saying, look, there are all these problems with one-sidedness throughout society that we can see. One-sidedness in the news every day, and Myers-Briggs typology should be a foundation that says, okay, you've developed in this way, but here's the way of overcoming one-sidedness. And when you can overcome that one-sidedness in yourself, you can start to overcome the one-sidedness in yourself in other areas of life as well. And you can help then, when you start to overcome that one-sidedness in other areas of your life, you can then start to contribute to society by overcoming one-sidedness as well. You become a sort of a cultural critic, in effect, identifying the ways in which we have become an increasingly polarized society. And the data does show that we are becoming increasingly polarized, politically, because people are identifying, identity politics is driving the one-sidedness. So sorry, it's a long answer to the question, but what I'm saying is that there is evidence to suggest that some people do individuate, some people do become more one-sided, but I can't actually put numbers on it.
Yeah. So I mean, and the point is that if there's, let's say, a minority, then perhaps Isabel Briggs Myers, by limiting that to a certain degree and as a generalization, she was right, because as a whole, that's as much as some people seem to achieve, or but perhaps she wasn't being ambitious enough in pushing beyond that. Who knows? But I think to a sort of credit there, at least there's a generalization that maybe the level she's describing is kind of typical of a lot of people.
Yeah, I think also that you see the danger is, and this is where I really, I think I just start to depart or start to put a wedge between Isabel Briggs Myers and Carl Gustav Jung. Isabel Briggs Myers called her book Gifts Differing, and I understand the reasons for that. And everybody has their own gifts, but they are societal gifts, and they're collective gifts. And actually, for Jung, they're a problem. If you look at the index to psychological types, there are 11 chapters, and 8 of them have the phrase "the type problem" in each, in the heading of the chapter, and that phrase appears all the way through. For him, being a type is a problem because it's one-sided, and he didn't think that everybody was a type. But there's a philosophy there, and this is the difference between Isabel Briggs Myers and Carl Gustav Jung. Isabel Briggs Myers says, let's celebrate your one-sidedness. Carl Gustav Jung says, look, your one-sidedness ultimately is a problem. It's damaging to society, and it's actually ultimately damaging to your individuality. It's a stage we've got to go through, but it's only a stage. It's stage 2 in this 4-stage model. And I think the fundamental difference between the two is this philosophy that one says, yes, being a type is a good thing. You contribute to society, and so on and so forth. For Jung, he says, well, okay, you've got to go to that stage, but actually, ultimately, it's a problem, because if you're one-sided, in fact, he used the word in psychological types, he says it's barbarian, because you only take that one-sided view, and what you need to do is to somehow reconcile yourself with the inferior function, and that's where the bridge is needed of the transcendent function to bring the two together and to generate a new attitude. So for one it's a virtue, for the other it's a problem.
That's right, yeah, it's a really nice way to put, I guess, the basic premise of your message that you're conveying through your work. So, and I've just got another comment here from Elizabeth Murphy. She says, I also find that when a person is very resistant to seeing the other side or other function, the operating function appears to be driven more by the unconscious energy. When they express that flexibility, considering opposites, it's because the function has developed to the level of conscious management being available. And she says, if so, it matters because to increase a person's psychological flexibility, you help them develop their functions. So she's bringing the unconscious and consciousness in here by saying that it's there's conscious management when the opposites start to be considered. Hopefully I've done justice to what she's saying there. I mean, how can you expand on that, Steve, in terms of the conscious and the unconscious and how they're important for that reconciliation process?
Well, I think everything, I agree with everything that Elizabeth said there. And I think it's a really succinct summary. And I think the only thing that I would perhaps add is that at one point Jung said, and again I come back to this word attitude, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of, if there's one attitude that I say is important above all others, it's the attitude that consciousness takes to the unconscious. So this idea that we actually recognize that we have an unconscious, and really what we need to do is to try and withdraw projections as much as possible, bring the unconscious to awareness as much as possible, and to let it transform us. And that's the sort of situation that Jung was working towards, that we end up with this sort of, opposites. We don't talk about Democrat and Republic. We don't talk about the UK remaining or leaving the EU. We talk about, first of all, our own attitude towards our own unconscious, and say, all these funny things happen in the world, maybe that's because I'm shaping the world or my experience of the world because of my own psyche, and that's because my unconscious is having an impact here. And that's the key thing here, is bringing that relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. And we can do it through type. And I think, what Elizabeth has described is a very good way of doing it through type. What I'm hoping that we can do is to then take it and say, well, okay, we can look at that development of consciousness and unconscious, superior and inferior, and apply it to politics, and apply it to religion, apply it to culture, apply it to nationalism, apply it to all sorts of different things as well that are causing some of the real strife. We can look at gender opposites. We can look at people who have a gender and people who don't have a gender. We can look at people who have a psychological type and people who don't have a psychological type. You know, I think when I stopped declaring myself as having a particular psychological type, I suddenly became an other to people who said, you've got to have a type. You can't say you've not got a type. There's something wrong with you. If you haven't got a type, if you're not declaring a type, there's something wrong with you. There's always another, to whichever way we go. And I think it's a question of expanding it out to look at, you know, to use type as a basis for saying, let's see if we can find a way of resolving the attitudes within ourselves and therefore the attitudes within society as well.
That's a powerful message. I think what we should probably do is end abound here, if that's all right with you, unless you've got anything else to ask. I think that anything else to say or any questions from anyone else. That's a really poignant point to end on, I think. And also, I'd like to. I love the end of books. So I like going to the end of a book, and it's just reading the last sentence from your book here, Steve, as well. I just like that one. It says, the most we can do is learn about the unconscious and allow ourselves to be transformed by the experience of coming to terms with it.
Yeah.
Nice way to end the book, and probably a nice way to end the webinar as well. I want to say thank you so much, Steve, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and ideas and wisdom with us. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody here.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the invite and for the opportunity to talk about it. I do apologise that I for the Victorian broadband that's been a hindrance, but I have really appreciated your invitation and the opportunity to talk.
That's fantastic, yeah. And everybody else, thank you for staying with us through this. And what I'll do is just come back onto the screen and to tell you a little bit about the next webinars that we've got coming up. I've programmed in a series once a month for the next few months. We've got our very own Susan Nash joining us on the 8th of October. And we've got one of our original BAPT members, Roy Childs, who's got some interesting thoughts to share with us about type criticisms, which he talked about again at this last conference. And then we've got John Beebe himself, who is joining us in December on the 3rd. Very excited about that as well. Talking about the unconscious and archetypes. And John, for a sneak bit of information for you, that this is breaking news, that he will be actually joining us for the BAPT conference next year as well. So that's exciting and another reason to get in there and book early. So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to end the meeting now, and we will see you next time for the next webinar. Okay, take care and see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.